So, Ani, bonjour. My name is Trish Meekins, as Dan has said, and I am from Chippewas and Nawash, or Nayashingaming, which is just up the peninsula here. But I'm currently working just for one more week at Saugeen First Nation, so I've had an opportunity to meet many of the community members at Saugeen. But today we are going to be talking about treaties and how it's important that we all know that we have a responsibility to know what treaties are. Does anybody know what a treaty is? Yep.
Is it like that treaty is an indigenous person or it's a culture?
It's an agreement, actually. So the treaty is an agreement between two nations, usually. And so when we talk about, well, I shouldn't say just two nations, in this case, many of our nations entered into treaties with the settlers. And where did the settlers come from? Does anybody know? Yep. Europe. Primarily England. Well, yes, we had people from France as well. We had the French here for a long time first before the English came. So yes, thank you. Good. So we'll just move on to the next slide and we'll start there. So in order to be classified as a nation, the United Nations defines what a nation is. Does anybody know what the United Nations are? Or have you heard of them before? Or do you know who they are? Anyone? Just yell it out there. Yep. That's right. Yeah, they're all allies, right? All the different nations that come together that are allies, right? So, so in order to be classified as a nation, these are all the things that you need to have in order to be a nation. So we have to have a common descent, so we have to have a shared history with our people. We have to have a distinct language and history, and it is a distinct race. So there's no other races that are like that out there in the world. And you have to have, like it's organized, so they have a governance system that governs the people of the nation, and it also has a territory, like a shared territory. So when we think of our communities, say like Saugeen First Nation, that land is communal. So when we talk about communal, that means that we don't actually get a deed for our land. Like if we bought land, say here in Southampton, we'd get a deed once we bought that land. In the community, we don't get a deed. So it is shared land amongst the people. Yes, there are certain families who have like, I guess, stewardship over certain areas in the community, but primarily the land is all, it all belongs to all of the people of Saugeen, okay? So that's in every single First Nations community across Canada. So that's what nation-to-nation relationships. So there are treaties that happen today, and those treaties usually happen between Canada and, say, the Chinese. So China, there would be a treaty there. I know there was one recently, I feel like, with Harper. But this happens all the time. I shouldn't say all the time, but when there's an agreement that needs to be made between nations. Okay? So this is a nation-to-nation relationship. Just like once you become friends with somebody, you hang out with that person, you learn to trust them, all that happens. So it's not just an agreement, but it's a relationship, okay? So we'll move on to the next slide. And what I wanted to let you know is that initially, before any settlers came to live here, it was all just millions of people living on Turtle Island. Does anybody know what Turtle Island is? Yep. Okay. Anyone know what Turtle Island is? Does any of you guys know what Turtle Island represents? Okay, so not quite. So North America is what Turtle Island is. So when we look at North America, you guys know what North America is, right? Yeah. So I'm going to draw North America, okay? So the way, it's very poor, of course. There's Hudson Bay up here, and this is Florida down here, and it looks something like this. And then we have our Great Lakes region, something like this. And where we are is this little peninsula. This is the Saugeen Peninsula. Okay? So this, all of North America, so this is Florida down here, so this is Canada and the United States. So based on our creation story, we initially called this place Turtle Island. And the reason why we call it Turtle Island is in that creation story, when Sky Woman fell from Sky World, the birds saw her falling, and the geese came up and caught her, and the turtle came up to the top of the water, and they said, yeah, you can put Sky Woman on my back. And so Sky Woman was placed on the back of the turtle. And so she was going to have some twins, right? So she had to do something right away, because she was going to give birth to these two little babies, and she had no food or anything to give these little guys. So she had to do something quick, right? And so what she said to all the animals, who were all like really inquisitive of why she fell from the sky and was placed on the back of the turtle, she asked all the animals if they could go and pick up some dirt from the bottom of the ocean. So that's what they did. All the animals, they tried to dive down and get some dirt to give to Sky Woman so she could place it on the back of the turtle. And all of the greatest divers, they all tried. They all tried to get some dirt, but they couldn't. And so finally, little otter, little wee tiny otter, he says, I'll go down, I'll get some dirt for you. All the other animals who are the good divers were like, okay, otter, we'll let you go, but even the greatest divers can't even get some dirt from the bottom of the ocean. So little otter dives down off the back of the turtle, and he goes down there for a really long time. And while he's down there, all the other animals are like, I don't know if little otter's going to make it. He's been down there a really long time. And sure enough, when they were saying that, his little lifeless body came to the top of the water, and all the animals pulled him onto the back of the turtle. And they were all mourning because he'd given up his life to try to save Sky Woman and her two babies. And while they were looking down at little otter, they noticed that in his hand there was some dirt. He actually got some dirt. So they were all very thankful that little otter gave up his life to get a little bit of dirt for Sky Woman to put in the middle of that turtle. And once she put it on the ground, she began to dance on just that little bit of dirt. And as she did, that earth began to grow. And it became larger and larger and larger. And when she first fell from Sky World, she grabbed onto some plants through the hole that she had fallen through. And those become our first medicines. So Sky Woman was able to plant all of the plants on Turtle Island. And this is why we call North America today Turtle Island. So it just represents North America. If we go over onto the other side where Africa and all of those countries are, they are all represented by the elephant, right? So in this area, we're the turtle. And if you look at Turtle Island, or if you look at an actual map, this is a very poor drawing, of course. If you look at it, you could almost see the shape of a turtle when you look at Turtle Island. And if you look at way back when, the land looked different than it does now, so different pieces of land have sort of broken off from Turtle Island, but that would be like the feet of the turtle. And we look where we are right now, we're actually at the heart of Turtle Island. So when we say Saugeen, it can be translated as the mouth of the river, or it could be translated in the teaching that I received when I was very young, is that Saugeen is very close to Zagidwin. Who can tell me what Zagidwin means? Anyone? So Zagidwin in our language means love. And so Zagidwin and Saugeen are very similar in their pronunciation, and we are living at the heart of Turtle Island. So this area that we live in, the Saugeen Ojibway Nation territory, which is a pretty big territory. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see the territory. Has anyone ever showed you that? How big the territory is? If we have time after I get through this, I'll show you how big the nation was. And there's actually some little posters over there too. Maybe you can take back to your classroom and just see how big the territory of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation is. It goes all the way down past Goderich, and it includes the Maitland Valley River system, all the way over to Collingwood, where the Nottawasaga River is, and then all the way north to the tip of Tobermory, and all of the land 7 miles around the Saugeen Peninsula, as it was called in its day. It's been renamed as the Bruce Peninsula, as more and more settlers have come on. but it is known as the Saugeen Peninsula, and it's really nice that the national park is now calling the Bruce Peninsula the Saugeen Peninsula. So we are starting to see some change there. But initially, when people came to Turtle Island, they used to just come and visit. So there were nations from all different places around the world who would come here to Turtle Island, and they would visit with our people. They would do some trading. Our people would show them, how to be able to survive on the land, and then they would carry on. And these were represented by, this here is, what is this? Does anybody know what kind of thing this is here? Yep. It does represent a treaty, but do you know what this is called? Yep. Nope, not a sash. Yep. A wampum belt, absolutely. So this is a wampum belt. And so all of our treaties for First Nations people, they're represented by a wampum belt. And so as you can see in this wampum belt, there is a whole bunch of tiny little beads that are sewn all together. Do you see that there? And so these little beads had to be sanded down and all the rest of it just to be able to sit side by side like they do. So you can imagine that this belt must have took a long time to make, eh? And so this is how we represented our treaties, because we looked at them as promises. And we took them very, very seriously when we made those agreements with the settlers. And so the settlers might just write some things down on a piece of paper, where we would actually make a belt like this as a meaningful agreement. And so this one in particular is about the peace and friendship. And what these two darker lines that you see on this belt is supposed to represent the First Nations people in Canada, or I should say Turtle Island, because there was no Canada, United States as it is right now. It was just all North America. So the settlers are representing one line, and the First Nations people in Canada represent the other line. And what it is supposed to mean is that these two different, very, very different nations were supposed to be able to walk side by side and never to interfere with each other's lives. Do you think that happened? No, because here we are all today, right? So this was the very first kinds of treaties that we've seen. Okay, and it's represented by this wampum. Okay, so this is long before it meant any land exchange or anything like that. It was just peace and friendship. Okay, any questions anytime you guys can ask me, okay? We'll go on to the next slide here. So one of the most, well, very first, but also a very important piece is the Royal Proclamation. Has anyone heard of the Royal Proclamation? Yeah? Do you know anything about it? No? So the Royal Proclamation is something that the king had to do, because what happened way back in the day when the settlers first came here is, our First Nations had relationships with the settlers as they came, as in particular the British, or the ones from England, right? And so this is what we have, and we see a strong presence of the British all around the Great Lakes. So they built all these different forts. You guys have heard of forts, right? Yeah. Can somebody tell me what a fort is? Yep.
Sort of like a hut in a way.
Yeah, but in this case, this would be a great big, fortress. A fortress, I guess you could say.
Okay.
So this has got like a, big fence around it. And when you see in those movies way back in the day, they had forts. They would build a fence around their dwellings, and they would live within that. And that's where the soldiers lived. Yep. Absolutely. Yep, so the British government would stay in these forts. And so they would live within the forts. And there was, actually at this time in 1763 when this happened, there was 11 forts all the way around the Great Lakes region. So there was Niagara, Detroit, Michilimackinac. You guys heard this kind of stuff before? I kind of remember this from being in history when I was a kid. Yep.
One of the forts, I'm pretty sure maybe like Fort William.
Could very well be, because William Johnson was one of the people who negotiated treaties, so very well could be. But these forts were around the Great Lakes region, and what was happening is This is Chief Pontiac. He was an Odawa war chief. So when I speak of Odawa, do you guys know what the Odawa Nation is or who it belongs to? When we talk about the Three Fires Confederacy, the Odawa is one of these nations. So when we look at the Anishinaabeg Nation, this is what you guys say in your land acknowledgement, right? Anishinaabeg Nation? Yeah. So the Anishinaabeg Nation is consisted of, do you guys say this every day? You guys don't say the land acknowledgement every day? Oh, okay, I thought you guys did. Okay, so when we think of the Anishinaabeg Nation, we call it the Three Fires Confederacy, right? Have you guys heard the Three Fires Confederacy?
Nope.
You never heard of the Three Fires Confederacy?
No.
Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. So the Anishinaabeg Nation is made up of the Three Fires Confederacy. And there's 3 nations that belong to this confederacy. Does anybody want to venture a guess as what 3 nations? No, they're nations of people. Yep. When you think about where you come from, what do you call yourself? You know what nation you belong to besides the Anishinaabe Nation? Are you Ojibwe? You are from Canada as a nation, so you're from England, but the First Nations people here, they belong to the Three Fires Confederacy that belong to 3 nations in this area, and they are the Ojibwe, okay? The Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Have you guys heard it pronounced this way before, or what do you guys usually say? Besides Potawatomi, what have you heard? There's a river. Yep. That's right. So usually it's called Potawatomi, right? So that's not really how we pronounce it. We pronounce it Potawatomi. Because in our language, we don't pronounce P's as P's, we pronounce them as B's. And when we think about Potawatomi, that means taking care of the fire. So when we look at these 3 nations, the Potawatomi looked after the fire, the Ojibwe were the faith keepers, and the Odawa were like the traders, the economic development part of the 3 nations, okay? So that's what you see in Saugeen Ojibway Nation territory. It's made up of these 3 nations, okay? So in each of our communities, so in Saugeen you would see these 3 nations, at Nawash you would see these 3 nations, you would see these 3 nations down in Walpole Island, you would see these 3 nations in Sarnia Reserve or Amshanang. All of those 3 nations will be in those communities. You have a question? No? Okay. So besides these 3 nations, we also have another group of nations that's actually the biggest First Nations community in all of Canada. Does anybody know which community that is? No, it's the 6 Nations, right? Has anybody heard of 6 Nations? Yeah, it's a pretty big community. And so there's 6 nations, and they're the Haudenosaunee Nation. That's how you say it in their language, Haudenosaunee. Which is the 6 Nations Confederacy. Does anybody know what those 6 nations are within the 6 Nations community? Yep. No. Has to be First Nations. Do you know any of the First Nations? Ontario is a province, and the community is in Ontario, but there are 6 nations. Yep.
Isn't one of them Mohawk?
Absolutely. Great. We're on the right track here. So Mohawk is the first one. Everyone always seems to get the Mohawk. And then after Mohawk is the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. So those were the first 5 nations, and the reason why they got together, just like our 3 nations here, is because our languages were very similar, so we could speak to each other. Yeah, there'd be a little bit of differences, but we could still understand each other. So just like the 6 nations, and the 6th nation that joined the 5 nations are the Tuscarora is the last nation that joined the first 5 nations, okay? So these are the 6 nations that also live in southern Ontario. I'm trying to give you all of the First Nations that live in southern Ontario, okay? Right kind of where we live and on up. If we follow the water, it actually goes on up into Michigan, into Wisconsin, and into Minnesota. And you'll see this as the Anishinaabeg. And then there's one more nation that is different than the Three Fires Confederacy and the 6 Nations. Does anyone know what that one is? That is the Lenni Lenape, or the Munsee Delaware, or the Lenape people. And if you look at the Lenape people, there are 2 communities around London. One is south of London called the Munsee Delaware. And Moravian Town is the other one, or Bucktown as we call it. Has anyone heard of those communities? Moravian Town, Munsee, Delaware? Yeah? You've heard of them? Good. Oh, in Delaware. Okay, so Delaware is different than the Munsee, Delaware. So there might be, do you know whereabouts do they live by London? Oh, okay, great. Pardon me? Yeah, it probably is. If it's right by London, south of London, it could very well be. Do they live on a reserve? No. Okay. So if they're living on a reserve, it would be the Munsee, Delaware, but there is a town called Delaware as well. Yeah. So these are all the nations that live in southern Ontario. Okay. And so what happens? Chief Pontiac is from the what nation? Odawa, right. Someone's paying attention here. Good job. So the Odawa Nation. So what he wants to do, what Chief Pontiac wants to do, is he wants to be good friends with the settlers. And the reason why he wants to be good friends is because the way all of our people, the way the First Nations people view Mother Earth, is her being our first mother. So when we look at Mother Earth, the way that First Nations perspective is that she is our first mother. She provides us shelter, she provides us water, and she provides us food. And we would never think to sell her. So this idea of buying pieces of Mother Earth, you wouldn't sell your mom's finger to somebody, would you? No. So this is how we viewed Mother Earth. We wouldn't sell that. So when the settlers came over and they were saying, hey, like I want to buy some land, they would say, can I have as much land as if I shoot this gun as far as this bullet would go? How accurate do you think that would be? Not very accurate, right? And then we're getting into all kinds of fights about who owns what. They would even say, how about you give me as much land as I can run in a day? Also, not very accurate, right? And we would have just the random individual settler asking the random individual First Nations person about this land ownership, where the translation was not happening. We did not understand in terms of buying a piece of land. There were, yes, you could come and live in our territory because Mother Earth is here for all of creation, including all the different people in the world. So they were all welcome to come. We had lived here as First Nations people for thousands of years prior to, and we could still go and get a drink out of the Great Lake and wouldn't get sick, or we could get a drink out of the river and we wouldn't get sick because nothing was polluted. And it wasn't very long ago, just over 100 years ago. And so what happens is, so Chief Pontiac's like, okay, you guys can come into our territory, you can hang around. But the agreement between the British and Chief Pontiac, as well as many other First Nations, was that the British would give them gifts in order to live on the land. So what kinds of gifts do you think that they brought?
Medicine.
Guns, absolutely. In that time, yeah, I'm sure they brought those ideas from England, but they would have to bring something to the people. Because remember the two-row wampum, right? We have the one where the settlers are doing their thing and we're doing our thing. Gunpowder.
They brought the name for it.
Well, it could be white flour. Yep. Absolutely. Cloth. Cloth they would bring, and different plants too. I was probably wasn't to our benefit, but yeah, they would bring the cloth. Yep.
Medicine.
Yeah, so in terms of medicine, so they would bring what they knew for medicine, but we actually had all of our medicine here. So anything that we needed to fix our ailments were all grown here on Turtle Island. We didn't have to go elsewhere to find the medicine. We actually could look after ourselves very well. And actually, the medicine that we have today are based on those plants that we used to use. They've just now made them synthetically so that they have the same properties as the plant, but it's made synthetically. So that's what we're taking today in terms of medicine. They are based on those, mixtures of plants that we used for medicine back then. So yeah, so this is what's happening. So with the settlers, they're also, trying to have our communities by this time stay a little bit more in place. So being Anishinaabe, we would go to different camps. So we would go to our summer camp where the fishing was good and the berries were good and that kind of thing. We would go to our winter camps where we were sheltered, but we knew that there was game. So we would move in different areas wherever it was easiest to live, I guess you could say. And we would move in smaller groupings as Anishinaabe, and that's who's here, right? As Anishinaabe, we would move in smaller groupings. So usually with our family or extended family, we would move around. And then in the summertime, we would all come together. Where the Haudenosaunee, they were farmers. So they would have these great big huge palisades. Does anybody know what a palisade is? Yeah, but a palisade is more like they would have like all the. Have you ever seen like all those little posts that they put side by side like that, and they're great big tall posts? They would have the longhouses in there, and usually there would be like a little maze in order to just get beyond to get into the community, because of course they didn't want anybody just walking in. You had to find your way through, so it would slow up whoever was coming. And they could identify who it was that was coming to the village. But they would have, like, the Haudenosaunee would have anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 people living in a palisade. And they were farmers. And they would grow the three sisters. Does anybody know what the three sisters are? Absolutely. Corn, beans, and squash. And so do you know why those three things were grown together? Yep. Do. Yeah, absolutely. So it's corn, beans, and squash. So when we think of green beans, that type of bean. So, oh great. How did you do that? You just slid it down, did you? Okay, so we have the corn, right, growing, and then we would have the beans that would grow around the corn, and then we would have the squash, which had these very wide leaves, and that would block out the sun so that no weeds could grow around the bottom of the plants. Pretty cool, hey? And they said that these bushels, there were so many of these bushels when the settlers first came, that we could actually feed all of Canada 3 times over today. That's how much there was back then. Pretty amazing, isn't it? It wasn't like we were over here starving, that's for sure. There was, we had nice clean water. We didn't, have any pollution, so we were able to, live off of the land. And that all changed, of course, once the settlers came, because they brought, you were saying there, these ideas about technology and industry and all of those kinds of things. So anyway, so Pontiac was saying, okay, well, the agreement was that you guys are supposed to give me this cloth and guns and flour and sugar and all the things that aren't good for us. But, you know, our people were becoming very reliant on them. And so 3 years go by. British hasn't given Pontiac or his people anything that they were promised. Yep. Okay. So they weren't getting what they were promised, so Pontiac said, okay, that's it, I had enough. I'm going to get some guys together and I'm going to take down some of these forts that you see here. Because what this was here, with these forts around the Great Lakes, this was the stronghold that the king had, that the British people had around all of our good drinking water, which is where all of our people lived, was around the Great Lakes region. So Pontiac said, okay, I'm going to go down and take out one of their forts. That's it, I had enough. So away he goes with his men, and he takes down one fort, and he finds that it's pretty easy, actually, more easy than he thought it was going to be, because it's supposed to be a fortress, right, with soldiers inside. So he ends up taking 9 of the 11 forts down in a very short period of time. And the king said, uh-oh, we better do something right away, because we need the First Nations people as our allies to be able to help us fight our wars, because what's happening is, yes, we had the British in the northern part of Canada. People were still loyal to the king at that time. But the English people who went more to the south of North America, they were calling themselves the independents. They didn't want to have any part to do with the king or England or any of that anymore. They're calling themselves the independents, okay? So here we have the independents down here, who are really from where? Where are the independents from? Right, they're still British, they're still English, but they're no longer, loyal to the crown anymore, or to the king, right? So they're here, and what they want to do is they want to be their own nation. So even though there's all kinds of, like, millions of First Nations people here in North America, the independents are saying, no, we're going to move north, and we're going to take over all of North America. Do you think that happened? No, because what would happen if they did? Well, we'd be Americans today, right? We wouldn't be Canadians. If the independents had to move north and wiped out all the British, we'd be Americans. But see, what the British, they wanted to make sure that they stayed really good friends with the First Nations people, because why? We knew the land really, really well. We knew how to fight. We didn't march towards each other and shoot. We hid in the bush and, had some strategy. And so they wanted our people to be friends with them still. So the king says, okay, we lost our stronghold. We better make a promise to the First Nations people in Canada. Or in Turtle Island, because there is no Canada, United States, right? This is only 1763. So what the king does is he writes up this royal proclamation, and it's one of many proclamations that the king would have written up. But this one in particular, it says, okay, I'm going to be like your father, and all of you First Nations people over in North America or Turtle Island are going to be like my kids. So I'm going to make sure that you guys don't go without anything. Whatever you need, we'll make sure we give it to you. For being on the land, right? For being here in our traditional territories. So no longer any land, there could be no more land transfers, like, hey, can I have as much land as I can run in a day, or shoot my gun? None of that could happen anymore, because the Crown said, and the British soldiers were enforcing it with all of the settlers that were coming. They said, you can't just go and do that anymore. Any land transfers have to be registered through the Crown. Yep. Back in the day, yeah, they would have shot their gun, and it sure would be, wouldn't it? And you'd think it'd probably hit trees too, so I don't know how much of shooting a gun would be worthwhile, but because like North America doesn't look like how it looks now. There was lots and lots of trees. They would say, even in this area, that you could almost not even see the sun with all of the trees. Lots and lots of trees, yep.
Because trees help us breathe.
Yeah.
Because trees
And transform it, yeah. So,
They transform it into art or what we're even
yeah.
right now. So, like in Toronto, there's barely any trees.
Right. So
There's
we
not
couldn't
even much.
very well do
Well,
that.
we see like here and there, but
Mm-hmm.
barely any.
Do you have a question?
A follow-up to that question that Ryan made, a fun fact is that trees actually only produce like 30% of our oxygen. I believe the other 70% is made by moss and algae, I believe.
Oh, I didn't know that. What do you know? Learn something all the time. So anyway, so this is what happens. So they make up this agreement, and how long do you think it would have took the king to draw up this paper?
I would say because,
Maybe an afternoon?
yeah,
Yeah? Wouldn't take long to write up a page, right?
maybe half an hour.
It might take him some time to think about things, and then it would take him very much time to write it. So this is what he writes up, and this is what the agreement is. So this document, even though it was made in 1763, it's still a living document today. So we still look at this as a live document, meaning we would still listen to what it says. Even though back then, I'll show you what it looked like back then. It looked quite a bit different than it does now. This is how it looked back then. When he made this agreement, this was the agreement that he made, and he said, okay, if you guys will still be my friends, I'll make sure that you guys don't need anything. If you agree that you let the 13 colonies up here sit where they are, and these 13 colonies are still there today. You know, we have Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, all the way up to Maine. Even New York is here. So you guys recognize those names, right? So they're obviously still here today. If we agreed to let these guys have that, everything else was supposed to be Indian country. But what you see here is two different maps that say two totally different things. They say everything on the west side of the Rocky Mountains is Spain in this map, and then over here, everything west of the Rocky Mountains is Louisiana. And yes, there were tracts of land that were called that, but you have to remember that there were First Nations people all the way through North America, all the way to the West Coast, as we know. What's the most kind of well-known nation on the West Coast? What? No, the Haida. The Haida or the Salish. They're all on the West Coast. Texas is actually south. It's right above Florida. It's right around here. So the Haida is also First Nations nation on the West Coast, okay? So all throughout North America, this is how it looked, okay? So he wrote this up. The king wrote it up in 1763. Can you go back one slide? And then the next year, in 1764, the British, or the king, invited all of the First Nations in southern Ontario to go and meet on the St. Clair River in Niagara Falls area, okay? So we all went down there and we met with the officials down there, and we agreed or ratified that royal proclamation. And this is the wampum belt that represents that royal proclamation. So again, all those little tiny beads all sewn together probably takes a good couple of months to make this belt, and this is how we felt as First Nations about this agreement. We thought that this was forever, just like the Peace and Friendship Treaty or wampum belt that we had saw before. That didn't happen, and of course what we see here is that we're supposed to be living side by side again, once again. This is what this is representing. Those little, so you see 1764 there, right? And then all those squares that you see are the different nations, okay, who agreed to that. So that is how our royal proclamation looked at that time. Okay, so we'll go one more. And then finally, I should talk about the War of 1812. What about the War of 1812? Do you know who all fought in the War of 1812? Yeah. No, that wasn't the slave war. It was the War of 1812 was to establish the boundary between Canada and the United States. I know. Sometimes you forget those things. You have to learn it over and over and over again. So the War of 1812 was all about making the border from Canada and the United States. So it was a good thing the king did something and said, hey, you guys, be my friend with that Treaty of Niagara or the Royal Proclamation, because what happened was that all of the British, all of our people, the Anishinaabe Nation, were already friends with the British. And the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, initially they were on the independent side, but then they found out that the independents weren't very nice to them, so they said, we're going to fight on the British side. So the Haudenosaunee, the Sioux, the Anishinaabe, they all fought on that British side. I shouldn't say that. Maybe the Sioux fought in the south, but Tecumseh was one of the Sioux. And Tecumseh was actually good friends with Chief Nawash. Has anyone heard of Chief Nawash before? Do you know who Chief Nawash is?
I heard of it, but I don't.
You don't know who he is? So Chief Nawash fought alongside Chief Tecumseh, who was a Sioux leader, Sioux chief. And Chief Nawash is actually where I come from when we say Chippewas and Nawash. Chief Nawash was the chief at the time that settled on the west side of the river in Owen Sound. I should show you guys that. You guys would probably find that interesting. But anyway, so Chief Nawash, that's where our community name comes from. So he fought alongside Tecumseh as well as Chief Joseph Brant. Have you guys heard of Chief Joseph Brant? In your history classes? No?
No.
Oh, I remember Brant so clearly when I was a kid. In grade 7, I think we learned it. So Chief Joseph Brant, he had like 5,000 warriors ready to go to protect this border at any given time. And Chief Desiranto, who was also a Mohawk warrior, he had 2,000 warriors ready to go at any given time over in the New York and Akwesasne area. So it wasn't just the Canadians and the Americans, or Canadians against Americans. It was all of our people who fought in that war. And it even went on into World War I and World War II. We had the highest per capita of enlistment in World War I and World War II. Does anybody know what I mean when I say that? Yeah. The most people signed up, more than any community in all of Canada. Crazy, eh? For a little wee tiny community, that anyone who was eligible to go fight in the war, our people signed up to fight. Because we wanted to protect our land, as we had done even way back then. So in 1867, so almost 100 years after the Royal Proclamation, Canada becomes confederated. And we see this border between Canada and the United States. And the British North American Act reaffirms who we are as treaty people. So it says that the act made the federal government responsible for First Nations, or Indians as we were called back then. Does anybody know why we were called Indians? You know?
A long time ago, like hundreds of years ago, I think I didn't name it. Some person wanted an easier way to get to India to trade, so he tried to sail across the world. And when he got there, he found out India, so it was actually First Nations.
That's absolutely right.
They called them Indians, and then they later stuck with it.
Yeah, do you know who that was?
I think I might have a clue, but I'm not entirely sure.
It's Christopher Columbus, right. So he lost his way, and he ended up here. And so they say, I like this story the best, is that, yes, it could be that he thought he was India, but what I heard, this is the story that I go with because I think it sounds really nice, is when he came here, he saw our people, and he called us Indios, which in his language meant beautiful, that we were very beautiful people in the way that we lived because we looked after our first mother, right? We didn't own our first mother and think that we had control of her. We looked after her. So a very big difference in the way that we viewed the earth, right? So we are stewards of the land, and it's already 5 to 12. I can't believe that. So, and then one more piece of legislation that also confirms how we are all treaty people in Canada is the Constitution Act in 1982. There's a specific section, Section 35, that addresses this as well. And they say that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. In this act, Aboriginal people of Canada include the Indian, the Inuit, and the Métis people of Canada. So it's nation to nation, which is which level of government? Federal, provincial, or municipal? Which level of government is nation to nation? Yep. Federal. That's right. Absolutely. Okay? So this is my last slide. Does anyone have any questions about treaties? Yep. I don't know if there's a most important one. I think the Royal Proclamation is pretty important because that was the first one where we enter into the first fiduciary agreement with the King. As much as it has helped us, it has also oppressed us as a people, so kind of put us down as a people. Yeah. And in this area, there's many. There's Treaty 45 and a half. Oh, here we go. So Treaty 45 and a half, this is when we had to give up all of this green area. So you see where Goderich, Arthur, Collingwood, this is the entire traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. So Treaty 45 and a half, we lost 2/3 of our traditional territory. And then Treaty 72, that's the one you guys have probably heard about. It concerns the whole Saugeen Peninsula, all that piece in black. And that is the one that's in the courts right now, that land claims in the court. Yep.
Why did you guys lose?
Well, we didn't lose it necessarily. It was over time when there's so many, if somebody promises you something over and over and over again and you believe them, and then they get us to a point where they say, you know, don't worry, we'll look after it. We'll look after it for you. So that's why we signed off. And when I talked to my grandfather about this, my grandfather was chief in our community for about 15 years, and he was also one of the founding members of the Union of Ontario Indians, in which he was also chief there. His name was Wilmer Najwan. And so when I talked to him and I asked him, I said, you know, Grandpa, like, what did people say? Why did they give up that land? He said, by this time, you just did what you were told. Because you got to remember there was residential schools that happened. There was the RCMP. All this stuff had happened before we even got to this stage. Yeah.
What's the RCMP?
Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Okay? So when the RCMP were formed out west, it was to keep our people away from the settlers as they put the railroad across Canada, as well as to keep the parents of our children away from the residential school so that the parents couldn't be around the kids. So that's how the RCMP were initially formed. Okay? All right, well, miigwech for coming and miigwech for listening and asking questions and participating.